In 1942, the sound of air raid sirens sent German citizens rushing to shelters. They had grown accustomed to British bombers thundering across their night skies. But this day was different. In broad daylight, American B-17 flying fortresses approached, their silver wings gleaming in the sunlight. German fighter pilots scrambled to intercept them, confident these daylight raiders would be easy targets. What they couldn't know was that this small formation represented just the beginning of what would become the most massive bombing campaign in history, one that Hitler's military strategists had dismissed as logistically impossible. The Americans cannot possibly build 8,000 heavy bombers, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring confidently assured Hitler in 1943. Their industrial capacity is impressive for automobiles and refrigerators, but the precision engineering required for a modern bomber fleet of that magnitude is beyond their capabilities. The Führer nodded in agreement. German intelligence reports had calculated the maximum American bomber production at perhaps 3,000 aircraft per year, an impressive figure, but manageable for the vaunted Luftwaffe. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 8,000 bombers seemed an absurd figure propaganda designed to intimidate Germany and boost Allied morale. After all, in 1941, the entire United States had fewer than 2,000 military aircraft, most obsolete by European standards. The Americans lacked the skilled workforce, the specialized machine tools, and the industrial culture needed for sophisticated weapons manufacturing at scale. Or so German planners believed. This belief would prove to be one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in military history. The seeds of this miscalculation were planted on November 28, 1941, when President Roosevelt summoned his military advisors to the White House. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was still 9 days away, but Roosevelt knew American involvement in the war was inevitable. What the Germans didn't know was that Roosevelt had been quietly preparing American industry for war production since 1940. "Gentlemen," Roosevelt addressed the room, "I want to discuss our strategic bombing capability." He slid a paper across the table. "Our current production stands at approximately 3,000 aircraft annually. I'm setting a new target, 8,000 heavy bombers dedicated to the European theatre." The room fell silent. The figure seemed impossible. General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, finally spoke. "Mr. President, with all due respect, that would require a complete transformation of American manufacturing." Roosevelt nodded. "Precisely. And that transformation begins today." What followed was one of history's most remarkable industrial mobilization efforts. Roosevelt's administration created the War Production Board with sweeping powers to convert civilian factories to military production. Automobile plants that once produced sedans and coupés were retooled to build bombers and fighters. Refrigerator factories began manufacturing aircraft parts. Typewriter companies produced machine guns. By April 1942, the first American bombers arrived in Britain. The British Royal Air Force had been bombing Germany for years, but only at night daytime raids had proven too costly. The Americans, however, believed in precision daylight bombing. Their B-17 flying fortresses were bristling with defensive machine guns and had self-sealing fuel tanks. American military planners believed these bombers, flying in tight formations, could defend themselves without fighter escorts deep into enemy territory. They were wrong. The early raids suffered devastating losses. On August 17, 1943, 376 American bombers launched a daring double strike against aircraft factories in Regensburg and ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, both critical to Germany's war machine. Without fighter escorts beyond Western Germany, the bombers were slaughtered. 60 aircraft were lost, and another 110 suffered damage. Nearly 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. The Germans called it Black Thursday. American commanders called it unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers and crews faster than they could be replaced. German intelligence analysts felt vindicated. Their assessment that America couldn't maintain large-scale bombing operations seemed confirmed. But in Detroit, Michigan, something remarkable was happening. At Willow Run, a Ford Motor Company facility built specifically for bomber production, Charles Sorensen was revolutionizing aircraft manufacturing. Sorensen had helped Henry Ford create the moving assembly line for automobiles in 1913. Now, he applied those same principles to building B-24 Liberator heavy bombers. Traditional aircraft manufacturers built planes like craftsmen, one at a time, with skilled workers hand-fitting each component. Sorensen believed bombers could be mass-produced like cars, with standardized parts moving along assembly lines. Most aviation experts thought he was delusional. The B-24 had over 1,200,000 individual parts, 60 times more complex than an automobile. Reuben Fleet, president of Consolidated Aircraft, the B-24's designer, laughed when Sorensen claimed he could produce one bomber per hour. Aircraft aren't cars, Fleet insisted. You can't mass-produce something this complex. Sorensen proved him wrong. The Willow Run facility spanned 3.5 million square feet, the largest factory under one roof in the world. The assembly line stretched over a mile long. At peak production, 42,000 workers, 65% of them women who had never held industrial jobs before, built a complete B-24 every 63 minutes. By 1944, Willow Run alone was producing more aircraft than the entire nation of Japan, and Willow Run was just one factory among dozens. Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle produced B-17 Flying Fortresses at a similar pace. Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach manufactured C-47 transport planes. Republic Aviation churned out P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. North American Aviation built P-51 Mustangs, the long-range fighter that would eventually turn the air war in Europe. In Marietta, Georgia, the Bell Aircraft Factory employed 37,000 workers, most of them women with no prior manufacturing experience. Mary Jackson, a former school teacher, recalled her first day at Bell. They handed me a rivet gun and said, "You're building bombers now." I'd never even changed a tire before. Yet, within months, these Rosie the Riveters were constructing sophisticated aircraft with precision that matched or exceeded pre-war standards. When German intelligence officers received reports of American women building bombers, they dismissed them as propaganda. The technical skills required for aircraft production, they believed, were beyond what women could master with brief training. This underestimation extended beyond gender. German analysts also failed to grasp America's capacity for innovation under pressure. The P-51 Mustang, which would become the finest fighter aircraft of the war, was designed, prototyped, and entered production in just 102 days after the contract was signed. When fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in 1943, it gained the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. By early 1944, the strategic picture had changed, dramatically. American factories were producing bombers and fighters faster than Germany could shoot them down. When a B-17 or B-24 was lost over Europe, another rolled off the assembly line within hours. When an American pilot was shot down, a replacement was already in training. German aircraft production, despite Albert Speer's remarkable efforts to increase output, couldn't keep pace. More critically, Germany was running out of trained pilots. German flight schools, short on fuel and constantly disrupted by Allied bombing, were rushed and inadequate. Veteran pilots, kept at the front without rotation, fought until exhaustion or death claimed them. In February 1944, the Americans launched Big Week, 6 consecutive days of massive air raids against German aircraft factories. Over 3,500 bomber sorties dropped more than 10,000 tons of bombs. Nearly 1,000 German fighters rose to challenge them. This time, the bombers weren't alone. The new P-51 Mustangs, equipped with drop tanks that extended their range, escorted the bombers all the way to their targets and back. The result was devastating for the Luftwaffe. 262 German fighters were destroyed, many of them flown by irreplaceable veteran pilots. By spring 1944, American bomber fleets numbering 800 to 1,000 aircraft were common sights over German skies. On March 6, 1944, over 700 American bombers struck Berlin in broad daylight, something German military leaders had assured Hitler could never happen. On the ground, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, was stunned by the scale of American industry's output. In a memo to Hitler, he wrote, "The enemy has achieved what we deemed impossible. Their bomber production has exceeded even their most optimistic projections. The Americans are now flying formation sizes that would have required our entire year's production to match." Hitler dismissed the report. "They are throwing everything they have at us in desperation," he insisted. "They cannot sustain this pace." But the pace not only continued, it accelerated. By D-Day in June 1944, the American 8th Air Force alone had over 2,000 heavy bombers and 1,000 fighters operating from England. The 15th Air Force added another 1,000 bombers from bases in Italy. Together with the British Royal Air Force, Allied air power had achieved complete supremacy over Europe. The numbers that German intelligence had once mocked as propaganda had become stark reality. Roosevelt's target of 8,000 bombers for the European theatre had not only been met, it had been doubled. By war's end, American factories had produced over 18,000 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers alone, plus thousands more medium bombers and tens of thousands of fighters. The human cost of this air campaign was enormous for both sides. Over 26,000 American airmen were killed in the European theatre. Another 28,000 became prisoners of war after being shot down. German civilian casualties from Allied bombing exceeded 600,000, yet the strategic impact was undeniable. By 1945, German war production was crippled. Oil refineries, transportation networks, and factories lay in ruins. The Luftwaffe had essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. German fighter pilots reported encountering formations of 500 bombers, escorted by 300 fighters, an overwhelming force that made interception futile. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Adolf Hitler lived to see the consequences of his military intelligence's catastrophic miscalculation. In his final days in the Führer bunker, as Soviet artillery pounded Berlin and American bombers roared overhead, he reportedly raged against his advisors, who had assured him American industrial capacity had been exaggerated. The lesson of this historical episode extends beyond military strategy. It reveals the danger of underestimating an adversary based on cultural bias rather than objective assessment. German planners had looked at America and seen a nation of consumers, not warriors, a society that built automobiles and appliances, not weapons of war. They failed to recognize that the same industrial genius that had revolutionized consumer production could be redirected toward military manufacturing. Perhaps most significantly, they underestimated American social flexibility, the willingness to transform civilian industries overnight, to train women and older men to perform skilled industrial work, to innovate manufacturing processes, and to sacrifice consumer comfort for military necessity. After the war, Albert Speer reflected on this miscalculation from his cell in Spandau prison. "We lost the war," he wrote, "not on the battlefields, but on the assembly lines of Detroit, Seattle, and 1,000 other American cities where production capacity simply overwhelmed us." By 1944, a single American factory was producing more aircraft per month than entire German industrial regions. The story of how America built 18,000 heavy bombers when Germany thought 8,000 impossible remains one of it is history's most remarkable examples of industrial mobilization. It demonstrates how quantitative advantages eventually become qualitative ones when the sheer weight of numbers overcomes even the most determined resistance. German fighter ace Adolf Galland, who commanded Luftwaffe fighter forces from 1941 to 1945, perhaps summed it up best in his post-war memoir. "The American bomber streams became an avalanche that buried us. We could shoot down dozens in a single day, and the next morning, the sky would be full again." It wasn't just their quantity, though, that was overwhelming. It was their quality, and the seemingly limitless supply of replacements for both machines and men. Against such industrial power, tactical brilliance alone could not prevail. Today, as we reflect on this massive industrial achievement, we should remember not just the engineering feats, but the human stories behind them. The women who left domestic life to build bombers, the factory workers who labored around the clock in shifts, the pilots who flew mission after mission against daunting odds, and yes, even the civilians on both sides who suffered under the rain of bombs. Their collective story reminds us that history's greatest challenges often reveal humanity's greatest capacities for both destruction and creation. As dawn broke over Dresden on February 13, 1945, Margarete Fryer woke to the familiar sound of air raid sirens. Having survived dozens of alerts before, she calmly gathered her children and headed for the basement shelter. But this night would be different. By morning, her city would be transformed into an inferno that claimed 25,000 lives. The firestorms created by RAF and American bombers generated temperatures so intense that victims were reduced to ash. Their shadows burned permanently into the pavement where they fell. "I saw people changed into torches running to and fro," she later recalled. "We couldn't help them. The smallest wounds were burning with phosphorus. They just lay down and died. When I turn my head today, 60 years later, I still see it." With Germany's defeat now certain, many questioned the military necessity of such devastating raids. The moral calculus of strategic bombing had become increasingly complex as victory approached. Dresden was just one of many German cities reduced to rubble in those final months. Frankfurt, Munich, Nuremberg, Würzburg, Hildesheim, ancient cultural centers with centuries of history were obliterated in single nights. By April 1945, as Allied ground forces pushed into Germany from east and west, the once mighty Luftwaffe had virtually ceased to exist. German aircraft production had collapsed under the weight of relentless bombing. The skies belonged to American and British planes, which roamed with near impunity over what remained of the Third Reich. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The air war in Europe was over. The human toll was staggering. The 8th Air Force alone lost 17,500 airmen killed in action. Another 21,000 became prisoners of war after being shot down. The psychological burden on surviving crews was immense. Many bomber groups had over 200% casualty rates over the course of the war, meaning the original crews were replaced twice over. What began as a desperate gamble, American daylight precision, bombing had evolved into an overwhelming force that helped break the Nazi war machine. But the true story wasn't simply about aircraft production numbers or bombing tonnage. It was about the human dimension of industrial warfare on an unprecedented scale. At Willow Run, Michigan, 22-year-old Rose Monroe had never seen an aircraft up close before 1942. A recently widowed mother of two, she took a job at the bomber plant out of financial necessity. The first time I saw a B-24 coming down the assembly line, I couldn't believe something that big could fly. She recalled in a post-war interview. Then they told me I was going to help build it. Rose became one of thousands of women who transformed the American workforce during the war. Before 1941, female employment in manufacturing hovered around 8%. By 1944, it exceeded 35%. Women operated drill presses, welded aircraft frames, assembled engines, and installed electrical systems, work previously considered exclusively male domain. Their contribution wasn't just in factories. The Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASPs, ferried newly built bombers from factories to military bases, freeing male pilots for combat duty. More than 1,000 women qualified for this dangerous work. 38 died in service when their aircraft malfunctioned or crashed. Margaret Phelan Taylor, a WASP who delivered bombers from 1943 to 1944, described flying a newly manufactured B-17. The paint was still wet. The engines had barely been tested. Sometimes they didn't work properly, but the factories were producing so many that thorough testing wasn't possible. We flew them anyway. This urgency of production created a stark contrast with German manufacturing. While American factories emphasized standardization and volume, German aircraft production remained semi-artisanal well into 1944. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 were superior in many technical aspects, but production methods required skilled craftsmen who became increasingly scarce as the war progressed. Erhard Milch, who oversaw German aircraft production, struggled to implement assembly line methods against resistance from engineering traditionalists. "Our engineers want to build perfect aircraft," he complained to Albert Speer in 1943. "The Americans understand that a good enough aircraft that actually reaches the battlefield is superior to a perfect aircraft that exists only in blueprints." By 1944, the quality gap had narrowed considerably. American aircraft designs matured, incorporating combat lessons from the European theatre. The P-51 Mustang, which began as an average fighter, evolved into perhaps the finest all-around combat aircraft of the war, when fitted with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, an ironic symbol of Allied cooperation. More significantly, American production methods improved quality while maintaining volume. Defect rates at Willow Run dropped from 50% in early 1943 to less than 10% by mid-1944, even as production speed increased. Workers developed pride in their craftsmanship despite the assembly line environment. Many painted personal messages on bomber components, "This one's for Pearl Harbor," or "Special delivery for Hitler." The human dimension extended beyond factory floors to engineering offices, where remarkable innovations emerged under wartime pressure. In 1943, the United States faced a critical shortage of aluminum needed for aircraft production. Engineers at Reynolds Metals developed new aluminum alloys using less critical materials without compromising structural integrity. When rubber supplies were cut off by Japanese conquest in the Pacific, American chemists created synthetic rubber alternatives in months rather than years. This spirit of innovation was perhaps best exemplified by the development of the proximity fuse, a tiny radar device that detonated anti-aircraft shells when near their targets rather than requiring direct hits. Developed by American scientists at Johns Hopkins University, the proximity fuse dramatically increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft batteries protecting bomber formations. The technology required miniaturization of vacuum tubes and circuits to fit inside artillery shells, something German scientists had attempted and abandoned as impossible. American engineers not only solved the technical challenges, but made the devices rugged enough to withstand the shock of being fired from artillery guns and mass-producible at reasonable cost. By contrast, German war production increasingly relied on forced labor as the conflict progressed. By 1944, approximately 7.6 million foreign workers were laboring in German factories, many of them prisoners of war or civilians from occupied countries working under brutal conditions. Sabotage was common. Quality suffered. Holocaust survivor Primo Levi, who worked as a chemist in a German synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz, later wrote, "We produced deliberately defective rubber when we could, small acts of resistance, but the only ones available to us. The Germans never understood that slaves make poor industrial workers." The moral contrast between American volunteer workers producing for a democratic cause and forced laborers in the Nazi war economy reflected the deeper, ethical dimensions of the conflict. Industrial production became not just a measure of economic strength, but of societal values. Yet the bombing campaign that resulted from America's industrial miracle raised its own profound moral questions. Strategic bombing aimed at breaking enemy morale through civilian casualties represented a troubling evolution in warfare, particularly when conducted by democracies that claimed to uphold humanitarian values. Army Air Forces General Curtis LeMay, who directed bombing operations against Japan after his service in Europe, acknowledged this contradiction. "If we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals." His statement reflected the uncomfortable reality that victory often determines which military actions history judges as necessary versus excessive. British Air Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris remained unapologetic about area bombing until his death. "The Germans sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind." His perspective resonated with many who had experienced the German bombing of Coventry, London, and other British cities during the Blitz. By war's end, strategic bombing had evolved from a theoretical concept to a devastating reality. The pre-war doctrine that precision bombing could target only military objectives proved largely illusory. Even with the advanced Norden bomb sight, accuracy remained limited by weather, defensive fire, and human factors. The definition of military targets expanded to include transportation hubs, power plants, and entire industrial districts, all located within civilian population centers. The increasing deadliness of the air campaign was enabled by constant innovation in bomber design and tactics. The B-17, which entered the war with 9 machine guns for defense, ended it with 13. Early bombers carried 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of bombs. By 1945, modified B-29s could deliver loads exceeding 20,000 pounds. Incendiary weapons, which proved far more destructive against urban targets than high explosives, became increasingly common as the war progressed. The firebombing of Hamburg in Operation Gomorrah, July 1943, created the first man-made firestorm in history, killing approximately 40,000 people and destroying over half the city's buildings. American military planners, who had initially emphasized precision bombing of specific industrial targets, gradually moved closer to the British area bombing approach as the war continued. By early 1945, the distinction between the two strategies had significantly blurred. J. Robert Oppenheimer, who led the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb, visited Germany after the war and was struck by the devastation conventional bombing had already wrought. The atomic bomb was not needed against Germany, he observed. The job was already done with TNT and incendiaries. For the airmen who flew these missions, the moral ambiguity of their task created psychological burdens that many carried for decades. Paul Tibbets, who later piloted the Enola Gay to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, first flew B-17 missions over Europe. "You can't see the faces from 25,000 feet, he said in a 1995 interview. "You tell yourself you're hitting factories, not people. But you know that's not entirely true." John Muirhead, a B-17 navigator, wrote in his memoir, "We were told we were destroying Nazi Germany's ability to make war. I believed that. I had to believe that. But sometimes, in the quiet moments after a mission, looking at reconnaissance photos of what we'd done to a German city, doubt would creep in. The doubt was not misplaced. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey revealed that strategic bombing had been less effective at reducing German war production than anticipated. German armaments output actually increased until mid-1944, despite intensive bombing, largely due to Albert Speer's reorganization of production and dispersal of factories. The most effective bombing turned out to be targeted campaigns against specific bottlenecks in German industry, particularly oil production and transportation networks, rather than general attacks on manufacturing capacity or civilian morale. The attacks on German synthetic fuel plants in May 1944, for instance, reduced aviation fuel production by 90% within months, effectively grounding the Luftwaffe regardless of how many fighters Germany could produce. These lessons influenced post-war military doctrine significantly, leading to more sophisticated targeting strategies in subsequent conflicts. Yet the fundamental ethical questions raised by strategic bombing remained unresolved in international law until long after World War II ended. For the German population that endured the bombing, the experience shaped generational attitudes toward war and international relations. Ursula Kirchner was 13 when Allied bombs destroyed her family home in Darmstadt. 60 years later, she reflected, "The experience made me a pacifist for life. When you've seen a city burn, when you've smelled burning flesh, you never want war again. Any war, for any reason." This sentiment helped drive post-war German support for European integration and multilateral institutions designed to prevent future conflicts. The European Coal and Steel Community, forerunner to today's European Union, was explicitly created to make war between member nations not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible, by integrating industrial production across borders. The architectural reconstruction of bombed German cities revealed another dimension of the war's impact. Cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Munich faced fundamental questions about whether to rebuild historical structures exactly as they were or create modern cities from the ruins. Different communities made different choices, but the very act of reconstruction became a statement about cultural identity and resilience. In the United States, the massive industrial mobilization permanently altered the nation's economic landscape. Regions like California and the Pacific Northwest, which had received enormous government investment in aircraft manufacturing, emerged from the war with modern industrial bases that drove post-war prosperity. Cities that had been manufacturing centers before the war, like Detroit, reached their peak of population and influence. The organizational lessons of wartime production transformed American business practices. Operations research, systems analysis, and statistical quality control, all enhanced during the war effort, became standard in peacetime industries. The government-industry collaboration that produced 18,000 bombers evolved into what President Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex, a permanent feature of American society. For individual Americans who had contributed to the production miracle, the war years often represented the most significant experience of their lives. Rose Monroe, who had helped build B-24 bombers at Willow Run, was later asked to appear in promotional films as Rosie the Riveter, an iconic symbol of women's contribution to victory. When the war ended and women were expected to leave factory jobs to returning veterans, many found the transition difficult. "I earned more as a riveter than I ever could as a secretary," said Phyllis Johnson, who worked at North American Aviation during the war. "More importantly, I was doing something that mattered. When they told us to go home after VJ Day, it felt like being demoted, not just from a job, but from purpose." Yet the war's industrial mobilization had permanently changed gender roles in the American workforce. Although many women did leave manufacturing after 1945, their proven capabilities during the war made it impossible to fully restore pre-war restrictions. The percentage of women in the workforce never returned to pre-1941 levels. African Americans similarly found that wartime industrial needs created opportunities previously denied them. The Fair Employment Practices Committee, established by Executive Order 8802 in 1941, prohibited discrimination in defense industries. While far from eliminating racial barriers, it represented the first federal action against employment discrimination since Reconstruction. Historian John Morton Blum observed that the war effort that defeated fascism abroad weakened prejudice at home. The contrast between fighting a war against Nazi racial ideology while maintaining segregation became increasingly difficult to justify. The seeds of the civil rights movement were planted in the industrial mobilization that produced America's bomber fleet. The strategic bombing campaign also created a troubling precedent for future conflicts. The acceptance of civilian casualties as a means to legitimate military ends, breaking enemy morale, or reducing industrial capacity, influenced Cold War planning and subsequent conflicts. When Curtis LeMay moved from Europe to command bombing operations against Japan, he applied the lessons of European strategic bombing with devastating effect in the firebombing of Japanese cities. The human cost of strategic bombing continues to raise difficult questions about the ethics of modern warfare. Dresden survivor Victor Klemperer wrote in his diary after the bombing, "To me, the death of civilians from the air seems the most horrible of modern warfare's horrors." Yet military historians continue to debate whether the bombing campaign shortened the war and ultimately saved lives by avoiding a protracted ground invasion of Germany. What remains undisputed is the remarkable achievement represented by America's bomber production. The 18,000 heavy bombers that German intelligence dismissed as impossible became reality through a unique convergence of industrial capacity, innovative engineering, management techniques, and human determination. This achievement stands as testament to both the destructive and creative capacities of modern industrial society. The same assembly lines that produced instruments of unprecedented destruction later turned to manufacturing commercial aircraft, automobiles, and household appliances that improved the quality of life for millions in the post-war world. The fact that many aircraft factories were converted to civilian production almost overnight after VJ Day demonstrated another dimension of American industrial flexibility. North American Aviation, which had produced thousands of P-51 Mustangs during the war, began developing the F-86 Sabre jet fighter, even as it returned to civilian aircraft production. Boeing transformed from building B-17 bombers to pioneering commercial jetliners, like the 707. For the German military planners who had dismissed America's production capabilities, the lesson came too late. As Albert Speer wrote from Spandau Prison, "We lost the war the moment the United States decided to become the arsenal of democracy. No tactical brilliance, no technological advantage could compensate for the simple reality of American industrial capacity once fully mobilized." General Adolf Galland, who had commanded German fighter forces against the Allied bomber offensive, reached a similar conclusion. We could achieve local victories, shoot down dozens of bombers in a single day, but we could never stop the flow. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. The victory won by American and Allied industrial might came at tremendous human cost on all sides. Aircrews who faced daunting odds on each mission, factory workers who labored around the clock to build the aircraft, and civilians who endured the bombing. Together, they wrote one of the most consequential chapters in the history of industrial warfare. In the end, the story of America's bomber production represents more than a remarkable industrial achievement. It demonstrates how societies under existential threat can mobilize resources, talent, and determination on unprecedented scales. It reveals both humanity's capacity for destruction and for creative problem-solving. And it reminds us that the greatest victories often come not from technological superiority or tactical brilliance, but from the collective efforts of ordinary people, united in extraordinary purpose. When we look back at those 18,000 bombers that German intelligence claimed could never be built, we see not just machines of war, but monuments to human potential, both its darkest and most brilliant expressions. Perhaps that is why the story continues to resonate decades after the bombers themselves were scrapped or relegated to museums. They represent both the tragedy of a world at war and the triumph of human ingenuity and determination in the face of humanity's greatest challenge. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.